Okay, we're going to start our lecture series for Unit 1 with a look at Chapter 1, A New World. We are looking at Columbian contact and beyond. So when Columbus makes contact here in the Americas, and then the European colonist and movement to the New World and beyond. These first few slides that I'm going to go over are just touching on the first Americans and the American Indians that were settled here in the New World long before Europe decides to explore this part of the globe. And so that's what we're going to start out with. First and foremost, Indians are going to settle in the New World between 15,000 and 40,000 to 60,000 years ago. The Bering Strait or the Bering Land Bridge is going to be a geographic bridge, right, that's going to be able, or I guess allow different groups and groupings of people to cross from the Eastern Hemisphere to the Western Hemisphere. And after the Ice Age happens and it is no longer a viable means or way to get across to the Americas, then these Indian cultures or these Indian societies, they're going to be here, right? And they're going to migrate and they're going to be able to set up their own systems and ways of surviving and living as a society in different cultures. And you're going to have different types of societies in the Americas themselves. North and South American societies, they're going to build roads, trade networks, temples, irrigation systems. And typically, you saw that South American societies were much grander and organized in scale than North American societies. So, for example, in South America, you're going to have societies like the Aztecs or the Incas, which the Aztecs were estimated to have roughly 250,000 people living in their capital of Tenochtitlan in the middle of Mexico, near modern-day Mexico City, and then at its height. And then the Incas, they're going to be in modern-day Peru, and at their height of their empire, they're estimated to have roughly 12 million people. So these are large societies, large cultures. They're very diverse. They have different beliefs and different technologies that they use to their advantage, but they are going to be more settled and much more developed in nature compared to North American societies. North American Indians, it is important to note that North American Indians are going to lack literacy, wheeled vehicles, the usage of metal tools, and scientific knowledge necessary for long-distance navigation. They're going to be much more nomadic in style, and they're not going to be nearly as developed as those South American societies, such as the Aztecs or the Incas. Okay. Other things to note and to just be aware of, especially as we move into Chapter 2 and Chapter 3 in this unit, we're going to be talking about the American Indians of Eastern North America quite a bit. And so, for example, you're going to see discussion of different tribes, such as the Iroquois, and you're going to have the Seneca, the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Cayuga, and the Onondaga tribes. And then you're also going to see in the southeast part of North America, the Choctaw, the Cherokee, and the Chickasaw tribes. So they may come up in our readings from time to time. They may be mentioned in your reading for class, but just be aware there are varied tribes across North America, and the eastern parts of North America will be a huge focus of Unit 1, especially once we introduce English colonization. Now, Indian tribes living in North America, and in particular these in the East, a lot of what they're doing is going to be subsistence farming and also hunting and gathering. They're not going to be settled for too long, but they will be able to stay in a place long enough in order to utilize and use their resources. So they're semi-nomadic early on, and then as time progresses, they're going to be much more inclined to stay in one place. So they're going to have, diets that are going to be pretty much comprised of corn, squash, and beans, as well as different proteins that are supplemented by fishing and hunting. And overall, Indians are going to see themselves as one group among many. And they definitely are going to be much more communal than the Europeans will be. They see themselves as a community versus a bunch of individuals in a community. And that will lead to some cultural belief and cultural conflict between American Indians and Europeans. Native American religion is going to also be something that will mystify European colonists. Native American religion are often directly related to farming and hunting, as well as seasons. So, the moon and sun cycles. Many tribes believed in animism. So, basically giving animated belief or animated properties to something that would otherwise be inanimate, like a tree or a rock or something that normally didn't move or animate on its own, but had sacred properties or sacred importance to a group of people or a tribe. Those who were believed to hold special powers held positions of respect and authority within these tribes. For example, shaman. And in Native American religion did not really pose a sharp distinction between the natural and the supernatural in general. So more often than not, the religion or spiritual practices of a Native American culture are going to be very different than the more written down, prescribed, and ornate nature of religion coming out of Europe during this time. Okay, land and property. So Native American tribes are going to view land and property in a much different light than European men and women will, as well as, the role of men and women in society. So I want to spend some time on this just to make sure it's clear that these groups of people, are going to have very different beliefs. Their beliefs are going to be structured on different types of social norms. And those social norms are going to be heavily impacted by the resources they have available to them, but also the technology that these people have been able to develop over time. So land and property and the idea of like private property, owning your own section or plot of land, while that might seem like something that's really, straightforward to us in a modern society, for Native Americans during this time period, during the 15th century and before, it's a foreign idea, right? It's not something that was meant to be individualized. Native Americans believed that land was a common resource and that it was not tied to economic prosperity. Whereas in Europe, land ownership was like the number one way to set yourself apart from other people. If you owned land, that meant you had wealth, right? You put your social stock and your economic or financial stock in owning land. And Native Americans, they didn't believe that. And so when these European cultures from Spain and the Netherlands and France and England, when they come over to the New World and they encounter these Native peoples, and they see that their cultural and social norms are not the same, it's going to be conflicting, and there's going to be some tension there. Wealth is not going to be an important focus for Native American societies. It's more about the community as a whole and making sure that the community as a whole, not just individuals, are able to prosper and move forward. Now, in terms of Indian gender relations, there's going to be some distinct differences between what Native Americans are doing and what Europeans are doing when they come to encounter each other and how their cultures work. One of the key things that I want to point out here is in a Native American society, women are going to have a different role in their society than European women will in their societies. More often than not, Indian societies are matrilineal, meaning children and clans are going to follow the lineage or the ancestry of their mothers. So they take their name, or they take their wealth, or they take any kind of notoriety they have from their mother's side of the family. Whereas in a European culture, and this is a norm that we still follow to this day, more often than not, families were patrilineal, meaning they are going to trace their family lineage or ancestry through their father's side of the family. So in our society, for example, today, most women, when they get married, they don't keep their maiden name or their name that came from their mother's side, right? They're going to take their husband's name, and that husband's name is taken from the father's line, right? The male's name is passed on. So for example, my grandmother's last name before she was married was Galloway. My mother's last name was not Galloway. It was Burkett. That was my grandfather's last name. So when my mother got married to my father, she changed her name from Burkett to Taylor, right? It passes through male lines versus female lines. But in society, you know, for Native Americans, tribes and villages were often very centralized, and men and women had their own kind of role to play in society. Men were going to be tribal and social leaders. They are going to hunt. They are going to protect against warring tribes. And then females, they're going to be the ones that are going to own tools. They're going to own dwellings and tools. And they're also going to be responsible for child rearing and agricultural responsibilities. So kind of in closing for this first section of our discussion, European views of Indians, right? We have these difference of cultures and social norms. And when these two differing sides or different cultural norms meet, there's going to be some conflict. So European views of the Indians. Europeans felt that Indians lacked a genuine religion. Now remember, it doesn't mean that these tribes didn't have religion or spirituality. They had their own set of rules or set of norms. But for Europeans, it was much more structured. And because Native Americans didn't have that same structure, Europeans interpreted that as a lack of religion or genuine religion. Europeans claimed that Indians did not use the land and thus had no claim to it. So due to the fact that Europeans don't really understand that Indians don't believe in private property, right? That belief that somebody owns this plot of land and it is theirs to use for their economic advantage. Because Indians didn't do that, Europeans didn't understand that, and they chose to operate with the Native Americans in a different way, and they wanted to privatize land ownership by claiming it, right? So if Indians didn't have an official economic claim to a piece of land, in the eyes of Europeans, that meant it was free for the taking and they could take that on as their own land. And then finally, Europeans are going to view Indian men as weak and that Indian women were mistreated. So this is going to be a misunderstanding of culture, right, and social norms. Indian men were not necessarily, you know, the last word and the ultimate head of the household in some of these Indian tribes and cultures. And because of that, European men didn't understand that society, right? Women in Europe, they were secondary or subservient to men, right, in terms of social structure. And Europeans didn't understand that, right? It was something hard for them to kind of come to grips with. And then in terms of Indian women being mistreated, you know, they worked really hard. Women had a lot on their plate, agricultural work, making sure that tools were maintained, making sure that children were being raised, making sure that the home or the dwelling was being upheld and that they had that ownership. And because they worked so hard, Europeans felt like Indian women were not being treated as gentle enough as they needed to be, right? As delicately as they needed to be. Women at this time in Europe were viewed as people that, yes, they could do work if you were not wealthy or of a lower social standing, but you were meant to be treated delicately, that men were to bear the burden of the harsh realities of life. And because that was equally distributed in Indian society between men and women, Europeans felt that women who were Native American were mistreated. We're going to pick up our discussion on our next video.